Okay, welcome everyone. Delighted to have you back this afternoon for a debate that's been causing quite a lot of anticipation, both amongst our team and also very much around our networks too. This morning, we introduced Anthony's keynote, Anthony Townsend's keynote. And in the process of speaking to Anthony, we thought it would be good to do something a little different. We at FutureEverything had been hitting up on an issue in conversations with other cities and in Manchester that actually we'd seen flagged up in Anthony's publication, A Planet for Civic Laboratories. The challenge of creating an intelligent design between the grassroots, the bottom-up, the civic approaches and the corporate approaches. And this still doesn't seem to be quite solved yet. And so we thought it would be good to bring some really key people together for a debate. The form of that debate and the focus has evolved into what we have today. The Bespoke Smart City. I'll let Anthony explain that proposition. We certainly hope that this can be one of the occasions that really helps move the agenda forward, that can become a reference point for people working on the front line in this field. These are important issues, the stakes are high, and we've got some fantastic people in the room to try and help pathfind through those challenges. I'm now going to make way for our host and our moderator, Nick Johnson. Nick, over to you.
Drew, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I think it is apposite, and I hope that you do, that this afternoon's debate about the reinvention of the city in response to emerging technologies takes place in the world's first city of the industrial age. The world's original modern city that seized and shaped the opportunities that emerged at the dawn of the last world revolution. The revolution that started in 1760 and was built around industry, manufacturing and enterprise. This afternoon's debate will, I hope, provoke thought about the implications that the technological revolution will have on shaping the lives of our cities. How we can build a bespoke city tuned to the needs of its citizens, buzzing with civic invention. Change doesn't come without its consequences. The last revolution brought riches and poverty in equal measure. Opulence, grandeur, abject poverty, exploitation, revolt, atonement, opportunity, oppression. What will be different this time? Will technology be the truly liberating democratic engine that its scholars and its disciples believe? Or, as we see the concentration of world capital and the belligerence of bankers, will we see the enrichment of the few and the impoverishment, or at the very least, impotence of many? The quest for utopia, our thoughts about the future, our predictions, our anticipations, our projections, all have their consequences. Architects, still inspired by Corbusian visions of the future, create places that reward their own intellect, and that their peers and their capital clients. They work for their peers and their capital clients, but fail on just about every level to reward the humans that are clothed by the spaces that they create. Our minds still reverberate with impressions of celluloid utopias and dystopias. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner conjure up fantasy images of cities that are rapidly becoming reality. But do they truly represent the future? Is not dystopia just utopia bereft of youthful optimism? And can we really shape our cities in a profound, democratic and genuinely local yet progressively global way? Here at FutureEverything, Drew's gathered us together to consider the potency and potential of new technology and the impact that this will have on our lives and the way we live them. Taking part in this afternoon's debate are some great thinkers. You'll have heard this morning from Anthony Townsend, who's written and spoken about the tensions and opportunities of technology in the context of cities and its implications. I'm interested to hear whether the rhetoric matches the reality, whether once we have an idea, the flight of global exploitation and the pursuit of Zuckerbergian riches is hardwired into every technology startup, the desire to renounce our past and our parochial parish and become truly global. Is this inevitable? And how does that in turn shape cities? Anthony has invited a select group of smart city designers, engineers and technologists to debate the smart city in front of you today. On the panel, we have Dave Carter, Manchester's own digital doctor, who's carved a living out of breathless evangelism for technology. He managed to convince the powers that be that the web had legs in the days when it represented subversive radicalism and manifested itself in progressive institutions such as the rather scary exclusivity of the Women's Electronic Village Hall, and when we all operated on CompuServe addresses. Dave is the city's digital grandfather. Actually, he's probably the digital godfather. Our own Berners-Lee, and profoundly important in his ability to create the platform for others to perform in. Catherine Mulligan is Research Fellow in the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Group at Imperial College London. I have to say that these CVs, I haven't consulted on any of the members of the speakers, and I've asked them if they're wrong to yell out. So Catherine has a practical background in innovation in industry. After 10 years working for Ericsson in Stockholm, in a fast-changing world of digital tectonics, the shift from practical, pragmatic handsets to multifunction platform smartphones must have had a profound effect on cities, both good and bad, from Stockholm to Seoul. Catherine's interest lies in the role that technology plays in the creation of citizen-centric, smart, sustainable cities. Through her work on sustainable society, Catherine has brought urban prototyping to London, bringing together a wide variety of disciplines to solve some of the world's most pressing problems using digital technologies in the urban environment. Duncan Wilson is an engineer for Intel, works on sustainable connected cities. The headline themes on Duncan's own website are spotting trends and designing futures, creating the digital layer in our physical world, and he considers cities canvas for his work. Lane Doody is an associate at Arup. She has over 17 years experience working in the IT industry, starting her career as a product manager in a small Dublin startup of 19 people that grew to 800 and completed a NASDAQ IPO within 5 years. She's been leading Arup's consulting work in smart cities looking at sustainable citizens' behaviour. Sascha Haselmayer is from Denmark and is Living Labs Global, an independent non-profit global organisation creating new ways to balance government, corporations and citizen organisations to work together, matchmaking Barcelona, Stockholm, Cape Town, Lagos, Chicago, Mexico City and San Francisco. Sascha is creating mechanisms to spread innovations to cities, improve governance and radically alter the way in which cities deliver much needed services, positioning the city as a lab. He is, he claims, creating a new space for all sectors to engage for greater social impact. So that rounds off the speakers that you will see this afternoon. The idea is that this is a genuine debate. We're going to try to, if we can, possibly avoid people just getting up, saying what they've got to say and making way for the next speaker. We do want a genuine debate. So Anthony and I are going to be roving around with mics to try and prod and poke and stimulate discussion. We do have quite some time. We've got until 4:45. We were messed up with the times before. We've got till 4:45, so it's a fascinating subject, and I hope we can engage you over the next hour or so. Anthony, would you like to take stage and take us forward? Thank you.
Okay, it's this guy again. So it's been 5 years since the iTunes App Store launched. Does anybody remember in July 2008 when that went online? You could finally buy apps for your smartphone. Although I wish I could buy an app to hold this up. Just a second. I don't know. I'm just going to hold it. So 5 years of apps, right? And in that period of time, developers have created 750,000 apps, 750,000 iOS apps. That doesn't count all the Android apps and all the other mobile platforms. They've been downloaded 40 billion times, by 500 million people around the world, half of those just in the last year. And a lot of those apps are aware of where you are. Location-aware apps are everywhere now. They're on all of our phones. This was sort of the holy grail of the wireless industry for the last 20 years, is to be able to create services on your phone that respond to your context. But what I started noticing over the last couple of years is just how many of those apps were made for specific cities or specific places. And there's examples of them that were very specific groups of people that inhabit specific kinds of places. So a couple of my favorites are Hills Are Evil, which was an app that was commissioned by Media Sandbox, which is kind of a tech accelerator that was operating down in Bristol for a number of years. And this is an app that just looks at your origin, your destination, where you want to go, and spits out a pain score based on how steep that route is going to be. And this was something that was very desirable for people in wheelchairs, cyclists, moms pushing prams. But again, very specific to this very hilly geography of the city. It would have been great in San Francisco, too. We should have had a version ported over there. Another favorite of mine was an app that was submitted for the first New York City Big Apps competition a couple of years ago. It was called Trees Near You. And basically, this was a browser for street trees. So you could, click, here I am. It would show you the trees around you. You could select it. It would show you the species, the year it was planted, other kinds of information. There was even talk in the second version about having a function where you could friend a tree outside your apartment building and build a social network with the other people who were also friends with that tree. Kind of a crazy app. Only worked in New York City, and only because it was powered off of open data. A street tree census that the city had done as part of its sustainability planning. Hills Are Evil was also built off open city data. So this kind of thing is happening everywhere. Go to any city and you'll see it. Portland, Oregon, right? This is a city of 500,000 people. It has 45 different transit apps that people can download and use that have all been created by citizens, again, all based on open data. And so when I was seeing this, it reminded me of a 2004 essay that Clay Shirky, who's a social media guru who's now moved on to much bigger and bolder topics than the city. But it was an essay, and it had a very elegant title. It was just called Situated Software. And in that essay, Clay drew a contrast between what he called the web school. This was the sort of software design mentality of the 1990s, of the dot-com age, where you wanted to build an application on the web that would appeal to everybody. It would have every bell and whistle so that you could scale an audience big enough to sustain advertising revenue. And the way he described it was that was where scalability, generality, and completeness were the key virtues. And what he saw basically was that was disappearing. And what was replacing it, and he really prefigured this whole explosion of apps, was this thing he called situated software, which was designed for use by a specific social group rather than for a generic set of users. And what he also noticed was that using open source technology and smart devices and Wi-Fi and other cheap kinds of networks, that anybody could slap together an application that only worked for 2 or 3 dozen people, but that was okay as long as it fit their very specific need. And this is the world that we now live in, where that is sort of the way people do things. And as an urbanist, I see that as a fantastic direction for technology. It's kind of the digital equivalent of what Bernard Rudolfsky called communal architecture, in this amazing 1965 book called Architecture Without Architects. Imagine that. And what he was talking about was how historically cities were sort of built out of the materials that they stood on, the mud and the straw, and turned into buildings of clay and stone over time by the people who lived there. And professional architects actually designed and built a very small percentage, mostly just the big government buildings and the churches. And this is sort of the thinking that inspired this forecast that I talked about this morning that we did in 2010, A Planet of Civic Laboratories. It was really just a celebration of this potential for local innovation in every city, and that the democratization of the technology that can be used to build smart cities would allow citizens to embark on this sort of limitless journey of combinatorial innovation over the coming years. And this view is pretty much diametrically opposed, I think, to the message that mayors and business leaders in cities all around the world were getting rammed down their throat by big technology companies. So 2011, I co-authored an article with Carlo Ratti from MIT that explored just this idea in Scientific American, that you have to deal with cities individually when you build big, complex technological systems, and that you have to craft very bespoke solutions for smart infrastructure and services. And this ad was the ad that IBM, who I'm sure had access to the copy before publication, ran on the back cover. And it conceded this sort of rhetorical point that every city is unique, but many face similar challenges. But the headline was very clear. A smart idea in one city can make any city smarter. Or, by extension, you can basically just cut and paste solutions from one place to another without tailoring them. They also claimed that they had amassed 2,000 smart city projects. And I saw this as sort of kind of a bit of hubris. But I also thought, wow, 2,000 projects. Maybe they're onto something. In the meantime, we had just built all these kind of crappy apps. And I think that's the problem with grassroots experiments, is that they take too long. They don't have capacity. They aren't rigorously evaluated and perfected. And most of these apps that are submitted in apps contests never get past version 1. John Garacci, who's a friend of mine who started a network of smart city hackers called DIY City in 2009, put it this way. He said, "It's dead simple to prototype version 1 of a smart city app. Getting it to version 7, where an entire city's population can use it, is a whole nother story." And this is just apps. Apps are easy. When you talk about embedding sensors and networks and actuators and digging up streets and hanging things off light poles, it gets a lot more complicated, a lot faster. And then ubiquitous computing, smart technologies have their own design problems and challenges. Gene Becker, who launched Hewlett-Packard's forays into ubiquitous computing in the early 1990s, wrote on his blog a couple years ago, "I used to say UbiComp was a 10-year problem. Now I think it's a 100-year problem." So he thinks it's going to be 100 years before we figure out how to put computers in the real world well. And so looking at these things, I'm no longer sure that we can afford to wait for a world of bespoke smart cities, as much as I'd like it to happen. And I'm growing convinced that what we're going to have to settle for, actually, is a smart city that's made to measure. Solutions that aren't custom tailored, but finished from a starter template. Now, the problem is there's going to be a lot of angst about this, because I think it means lowering industry's expectations of how fast the market is going to scale and how fast deployments are going to speed. It's going to mean spending more on R&D. I think we're going to have to lower citizens' and designers' expectations about the level of custom fit they're going to get from technology. And there may be some potentially painful adjustments along the way to new ways of doing things. And I think, for city leaders, this is going to be a tough struggle to solve problems with the technology that's at hand, the made-to-measure solutions, while also doing it in a way that's unique enough that they can distinguish themselves in this global battle for talent and investment and not look like every other smart city. And then they'll have to balance budgets because bespoke will be more expensive. So this is kind of a nice philosophical debate. But the challenge that I want to leave this panel with is very specific and a bit unfair. How much of the smart city can we actually make to measure? And how much has to be bespoke? Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Is it 100%? Are there really things that we can just cut and paste from Johannesburg to Glasgow or from Manchester to Medellin? And I know it's not just as simple as a percentage, because even different kinds of projects will have different kinds of ratios. But I think we have to start somewhere, and I want you all to see where different stakeholders in this big project we're undertaking fall out on that spectrum. And my own proposition from my own personal experience building a tiny piece of smart cities is that it's going to be a pretty modest share. Back in the early 2000s, when I was building free Wi-Fi in public places in New York City, like Bryant Park, which you see here, I used to think a lot about Robert Moses, who is this power broker in New York, master physical planner, who once reflected, as he was, I guess, thinking about shoving the Cross Bronx Expressway through a neighborhood and displacing, 50 to 100,000 people. He said, when you operate in an overbuilt metropolis, you have to hack your way with a meat axe. It's kind of a really harsh way of thinking about urban planning. But and when we were putting these Wi-Fi hotspots up, it wasn't the technology that made our work hard. It was real estate. I mean, configuring a router was easy. Configuring a lease to get an antenna put up was next to impossible because people had no idea what we were doing, how much we were willing to pay, or what the risks were. Getting bandwidth was a cinch. Getting a power line pulled by this 100-year-old monopoly utility was impossible. And so I concluded the hardest part of doing community Wi-Fi was the community. This wasn't, Greenfield and Masdar or Songdo in Korea. This is a real city. It had unions who didn't like things we were doing and wanted us to pay them. Had homeless people who would fool with our equipment. There were pigeons and rats that would fool with our equipment, and we were even dive bombed by a red-tailed hawk during an installation on the side of a building. And what I learned, from that is that there's this kind of Pareto rule, an 80-20 rule, at least for building networks in smart cities. You can really only cut and paste 20%, and that's the hardware. The other 80% of your budget for your project is service, support, and connectivity, and those things have to be bespoke for every project. So what I want to leave you guys with is what if it only is 20% that can be cut and pasted? And what does that mean for how we dream and design and build systems in the smart city? And is it enough? I mean, this is a rather urgent project given the economic and environmental challenges that we face. If we can only, share 20%, is that going to get us to where we need? And the final question is, am I just completely wrong? Is it a greater share than that? So I'll turn it back over to Nick to introduce the next speaker.
Anthony, am I on here, guys? Anthony, thank you for that. A couple of things that I take from that before I introduce Dave. Is that 20% an empirically tested 20%, or is that kind of just a feeling? Because the question that came in my mind was, I would have thought that percentage would have been much greater, and the distance to make something bespoke would only be the top 20%. You're saying it's actually 80%, and I don't know where that kind of analysis has come from.
For networking projects, for data networking projects, it's kind of a rule that a lot of people use, is that your hardware is 20%, and then the connectivity, the bandwidth, the service, and the ongoing support of your users takes up about 80% of your budget. So for that very specific kind of smart city solution, building the data network, that's my experience, is 20%.
What about the apps then? You started off by talking about apps and the way in which they were bespoke for cities. Presumably the raw basis of those could be transferred and could be replicated and then localized with a small percentage of alteration.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
I think the ratio is different for different technologies.
Yeah. The other thing, I'm just about to introduce Dave Carter, but it was interesting coming from a real estate background myself, that it's the real estate people that hold you back in terms of delivering the infrastructure and the technology. They won't allow you to put things on buildings. You need leases. Dave Carter may wish to tell you, he may not, but there were some subversive actions within Manchester City Council where they put all these, the high-speed data network that exists around the city that's free, they installed in buildings owned by many different building owners, but they said that they were just going to put this thing up there temporarily. And if you say it's temporary, nobody asks you for a lease. If you say we're just going to leave it there for a few weeks, and I think you'll find that some of those things have been there for years. There's one, in fact, on the top of the town hall that nobody knows about. And one day they thought they'd been rumbled when they got a phone call from the city solicitor. In actual fact, it was with a woman in the city solicitor's office ringing to say, I can't get onto the network. So kind of there are subversive ways of delivering technology. The next two speakers are really are kind of distinct from the following three in that they're commissioners in many respects of technology. And they're going to take over the next two slots, and then we're going to have a brief conversation and introduce the final three speakers, the first of which is Dave Carter. Dave, thank you.
Thanks. Great. Well, thanks very much, and thanks, Nick, for that rather over-generous introduction. I run the city's digital development agency. We focus on three things: digital inclusion, digital industries, and digital innovation, and we're one part of the city really focusing on the idea of a digital strategy that really kind of connects with people and brings in people. But before I go back and talk a little bit about that, I just wanted to talk about smart cities, because smart cities are everywhere. You know, who wouldn't want to be a smart city? When I was up in Edinburgh last year for, you've guessed it, a Smart Cities conference, I walked past the Smart City Hostel. And I thought, well, I've got to see this, a Smart City Hostel. And it did have probably a few more computers in the bar area, but it was basically a backpackers hostel. So if we're not careful, we completely devalue the idea of smart cities, because it's just being seen as a brand or a logo that you've got to have. And I kind of want to move very much beyond that. So one of the bits of history, I'm a historian who got into tech, so I can tell you a lot more about the history of what's in your smartphone rather than actually what's in it. But one of the things I'm always amazed about is if you go back to the late Victorian period, and there was this thing called the telephone. And telephones didn't go public because it was a good idea. They went public because people campaigned for them. They campaigned to have a public telephone box. Because when you read some of the stories about what the ruling elite thought about telephones, they said, well, first of all, ordinary working class people are too stupid to be able to use them, so that would be a dilemma. Then they would waste time on idle gossip if they had access to a phone. And shock horror, the criminal classes might use the technology to organise crime. So I think we've heard that somewhere before. And it was only because people made demands, and the more democratic institutions, which I would argue things like cities and local authorities can be, actually took notice of that and brought in local legislation to say, no, you know, we are going to invest in this. We do believe that people should have access. And it was very funny going back, because this year we celebrate 20 years of the launch of Telecities, which was the first European network set up here in Manchester in 1993, where we talked about cities coming together to articulate the urban demand for telematics. Great slogan. You can imagine walking down the street, we demand, articulate urban telematics. But that came out not of technology, it actually came out of a group of human rights activists who were influenced by things like the Chaos Computer Club and the Transnational Information Exchange, who were they were building modems in shoeboxes, and they were connecting the telex system, which is pretty broad, it's a global network, with email via things like X25 protocols. And so Amnesty had its own email network globally in the late 80s. And so when a human rights activist got arrested, people went to their local telex, of which there were plenty, sent information in, and before even probably the local police force knew they'd arrested a human rights activist, those embassies were being bombarded by faxes sent through an email fax gateway to campaign against that. So there's a real history here. And the point of this slide is that it's contested. That at that time, technology companies didn't want to be associated with this idea that this would be a liberating technology that might be used for these nefarious things. And many of the activists said, well, we're not touching that because we'll be trailed. People will perhaps know where we are with this mobile phone. Early phone couldn't really do that, but anyway. But that's the great thing about it, the fact that it is contested, the fact that say Anthony, I think, was very pleasantly surprised when we told him last week that for the past 2 years, his document has been circulating right around cities around Europe in our Connected Smart Cities Network, which I chair, and really stimulating debate. So, you know, these things are important. Just go on. Oh, sorry, I've just pressed the neutral one. That's it. So the other thing that was great about listening to Anthony this morning is I think the two things we've tried to do, because, you know, we are not a rich city, we've never been a rich city, and we're completely skint now because the government have taken 30% of our income away from us. So investing in people to do things for themselves has always been an important point. So roll your own network. Yeah, we do go around and say, hey, we're the Living Lab, we're just going to put this kit up temporarily because we want to test it. And who would be against research and testing? And we just leave it there. So, you know, we've got a little Wi-Fi tree in the Northern Quarter, and we've got kit inside, you know, church towers that only the minister or priest knows about and things like that. But that's important because it's a way of extending public ownership without all the baggage and history. So public ownership can be about enabling and facilitating people to do things, people to have an open infrastructure, open networks, and creative spaces like Mad Lab, where we would love to go into, say, sensors for air quality. We're part of a future Internet of Things initiative, but we haven't got the money. So what should we do? We should help people build using free hardware, using Arduino technology, and we should get people to put the networks up. And we will help with the standards, with the configuration, with the calibration, all of that, but get people empowered to do this for themselves with the backing of an institution like the City Council, not a top-down thing facilitated by the City Council. And when we come on to the future of all this, just to give you one tiny example of a current debate. And the debate is, if you go along with what Chris Anderson argues, which, you know, we've got one of the first fab labs in Britain here, about the maker's revolution and the impact of 3D technology, 3D printing. And then you go, right, 10 years' time, just about every business has really sophisticated 3D printers, and many, many people either have 3D printers or have access to them. So question one, what are we doing now? Because the cycle for curriculum in education is about 10 years. So what are we doing now to empower kids to be able to access that and have the skills and have the jobs? Hopefully, great. But the other thing, as a city, also, just imagine, so there's all these people with this in their garages or their sheds or their houses, and it makes a smell. You know, solvents kind of make a smell. So if you're being quite successful, you're quite entrepreneurial, you're making things again in the community, in back gardens, in public parks or whatever, somebody comes along and they're going to phone the council and say, that lot next door, they're making things in their garage and it smells and it's noisy. So what should be our approach? Do we go, here's an enforcement notice, you can't do that 3D printing in our town, thanks very much? Or do we go around and say, hey, here's an education pack, maybe you'd like to come along to our digital lab and find out more and see how you could create a job for yourself out of this. But it is those dilemmas, the disruptive technologies, you just not everyone thinks about. So two final points, really. Firstly, we have set up the Connected Smart Cities Network. It does have a very, very basic alpha version website. We'll be launching the beta version afterwards. And, you know, that tradition, when we have the 20th anniversary conference here called From Tele-Cities to Smart Cities, 20 years of urban digital, and when we host the International and European Living Labs summer school here in the summer, we really want to make sure this debate gets carried forward. And that's what we hope an event like today, because those of you who are here, you know, you heard it here first. I mean, I think this is really repositioning this from a rather obscure area into the public domain. And that's one of the things I think here in Manchester we're good at, is taking things, reassembling them and making them big and public. And so that contestation can really help inform ideas and at the end of the day, create new skills, create new jobs and bring some economic impact. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. That's great. I would have thought that here in Manchester it's quite difficult to tell whether banging in garden sheds and the smell of solvents coming out of them is abuse or constructive use of new technology. The next speaker is, with me now, Catherine Mulligan. Catherine from Imperial College. Would you like to take the stage?
Hi everyone, so my name's Catherine Mulligan from Imperial College and I work on 3 projects there, one of which is the Digital Cities Exchange project, which looks at all of the massive data streams coming off different infrastructure across the city and how you can combine those together and make new services and new jobs and new industries and new economic growth from that. One thing that has always struck me, however, is the idea that, well actually, when you talk about a city, a lot of the issues around how citizens and cities and government interact with each other, they're actually ancient questions. And so the first quote I could find around this is actually from Plato. So the city is what it is because our citizens are who they are. And I think a lot of the digital city technology and the smart city technology and the approaches taken that are very public and very well advertised quite often are about large-scale data analytics, massive sensing of the city, throwing out sensors everywhere, and then saying, well, hey, these computers, these systems can now make better decisions than human beings. And for me, that's sort of a fundamentally incorrect way to look at this, because if you look at a city, if it's not just a bunch of buildings, if you take the people out, it's just a bunch of buildings talking to each other, and that's not actually a city. So the city is what it is because of the people. And so one of the things that I've been looking at and investigating and trying to understand is how can we create understanding and trust of these technologies for citizens. So, I mean, citizens will reject these technologies if they don't trust them, if there's no protection of privacy, if there's no creation of explanation or explanation of the concepts and the ideas of what this is actually supposed to achieve. So, I mean, for me, the next or the coming revolution is actually definitely going to be digitalized, but I think the other, as the other speakers have been saying already, it's actually going to also be deeply human, and it has to be deeply human in order for it to be successful. So one of the things that we've been looking at, and we did this in conjunction with Lane actually from Arup, so it was great to be here with her as well, is the idea of a value chain for smart cities. How do you actually build all of these technologies together, and how do you actually connect data streams together in a functional and a usable manner? So on the left-hand side, we have a bunch of real-time data inputs, including the citizen themselves and their mobile devices. We've got public transport. Obviously, I'm sure many people are aware of the amount of data that TfL have. We've got the mobile networks. A foundational part, I believe, of creating a smart city is obviously the mobile networks. The city areas themselves, so the smart buildings, temperature, environmental data about those buildings. And then, of course, things like maps and geography and how you're actually locating yourself within that city. We combine all of these together into raw data. Moving along up to the information component, we can actually start making decisions. So, for example, the number of mobile subscribers on a bus in a particular neighbourhood tells you something about the demographics of that neighbourhood and, you know, how the traffic is being used, how the public transport is being used. And then that gives you an information product which gives you an improved decision-making capacity. And the important part of this actually is the value chain governance, which is that tiny little line on the top, which most people seem to bypass in their discussion. So the technology obviously quite often takes the forefront of the discussion, rather than how you're going to manage it, how you're going to create planning permission for it, etc., etc. So that's a very simple value chain, and it illustrates how many different people are going to have to come together in order to form an actual smart city. So I have now a question for the audience here, a bit of audience participation. Who is bored by this diagram? Thank you. Okay, I can ask that question because we wrote it. It is actually a phenomenally boring way to talk about a smart city. It's an important way because I have to understand and explain the scale. But one of the things that I think is missing in a lot of the discussions is creating a sense of play and a sense of space for play for actual citizens to create and engage and understand these technologies. So we've actually set up a series of experiments around this in London in April, where we're going to take... it's an urban prototyping festival in London in April. It's been done previously in Singapore and San Francisco, and it's basically an initiative of the Grey Area Foundation for the Arts, who are located in San Francisco. The idea here is that we're actually going to take the technology out to the streets and get citizens to build and create their own prototypes in the city, rapidly prototype them very quickly in order to create some education and understanding around these technologies. And then we've also done something quite unique and quite hard work, which is to try to create the follow-on funding opportunities for people to not just do a hackathon or do a rapid prototype, but actually get follow-on funding to maybe potentially create a micro-startup or something like that as well. So everyone's very welcome to join us. Please do get involved. And I promise you, it is a hell of a lot more fun than that previous diagram. But I think that is one of the big issues for me, is how do we reconcile the need for economies of scale and the need for very large corporations, where you actually need those guys to actually deliver the low-cost and highly available infrastructure, but in combination with giving citizens a sense of play and a sense of space and a sense of beauty in their environment, which is enhanced by the digital technology that they use. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Anthony, I'm going to call upon you in 1 second, because I think you want to make a few points or a few provocations, because you did say at the outset when we were upstairs that you really didn't want any consensus to come out of the discussion that was going to take place this afternoon. Consensus is when you reach compromise and try and move things forward, perhaps to a lesser or greater satisfaction having received that compromise. And we don't have to do that here today. So I think you wanted to kind of stimulate the debate and discussion. I was interested in, Catherine, the fact that you kind of talked about humanity in the context of what we're talking about. And of course, cities is all about being human. And I suppose a few things worry me about the way, from a personal level, the way in which data is being used and captured and harvested, and then either sold or because we allow data capture. It's kind of convenience for us, isn't it? It speeds things up. It allows us through gates. It tells people what our preferences are, and convenience. With that convenience comes a degree of extinguishment of souls. You know, every time something gets a little bit easier, you lose a little bit of soul behind something. And I'm just worried that whether convenience and the capture of data and making things easier for us is actually starting to extinguish a reason. And because part of the joy of being in cities is the frustration, is the chaos, is that things aren't ordered, is that things aren't always easy. And that's kind of why I like cities. But and obviously there are moments when you need that convenience. But where do you draw the line? And what happens to all that data? And what are the implications for us? I don't know. But there are two sides to the coin. Anthony, have you got...
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say is that neither of you answered my challenge of what percentage of the smart city can be copied from one to another. So the three final speakers are really on the hook to put some pins on the map about that. One point of not disagreement, but just different point of view that I noticed between what Dave and Catherine said, it sounded like Dave was saying is that maybe skills, maybe learning is the thing that gets copied from city to city through these networks of maker spaces and fab labs, and that's actually the thing that we should be focusing on. What I heard Catherine saying is that maybe it's the business models, maybe it's the value chain that can be copied from city to city. So that's something I'd like to explore further. And then one other thing I just wanted to remark on is this issue of temporariness versus permanence. You know, I think there's a lot of urge from civic leadership to lock down solutions to problems before the next election cycle runs, and to sort of pour some concrete and not do temporary things, although temporary gives you a lot of freedom to play. So I think that's a tension that's definitely emerging.
I mean, for me, that was a liberating thing. It's always liberating when you speak to Dave Carter, because he works in an institution which inevitably tries to control or prevent things from happening. And you've always been a great liberator, Dave. And I joked, and you told the story about doing things temporary. But temporary is temporary the new permanent? Because I'm fascinated from a point of view of real estate. The whole kind of real estate industry builds things that are permanent. We are a building that will last a lifetime now. And but if you consider the retail environment in which we interact with at street level, that kind of constantly changes. That constantly reinvents itself. Every 2 to 3 years, it needs to make over to respond to the emerging trends, to make itself attractive. And we don't, therefore, need the cloak of permanence around those kind of things, and it allows things to happen. If you say it's not for real, it's not going to be there forever, you don't need the tickets, you don't need the approvals, you don't need the planning consent, you don't need the regulators to come in and intervene and spoil your fun. And I just wonder, we're seeing the emergence of pop-up events, pop-up moments, of which this is one, pretty much everywhere. And is that sense of impermanence actually the thing that's really invigorating in cities? And actually, is technology a way of connecting that up and actually starting to enable you to exist without the cloak of permanence that we've hitherto expected. I mean, that's quite, it's quite interesting if we were to consider a city being entirely impermanent, what that might look like and what that might feel like. We're going to move on to the next session. I think unless we might take, if there's any questions that people want to ask right now, there's a guy with his hand up on the right over here. We've got a roving mic. If you could just say who you are and which institution or organisation you represent, if any.
Hi, my name is Robin Gower. I'm a freelance economist and software developer. And I thought it was interesting to hear you talking about what Michael Heller calls the anti-commons, this notion that you've got these competing constraints on the standards that stop innovation happening, the notion that there's possibly palliative care for Alzheimer's, but there's too many people with patents on parts of the genome for it to ever come to fruition. And I just wanted to respond to the question you'd asked about what percentage can we share from city to city, and I think that similarly to having openness as the way to deal with this what Michael Heller calls the gridlock economy, it's open standards will be the thing that's transferable from city to city, and the citizens are different. But if you look at something like the general transit specification, this is a sort of an emerging open standard 311, similarly open 311. It's that sort of thing that we'll be able to learn and learn together and build common standards together that will be used in different cities. And the only thing that's going to prevent us actually benefiting from that is if we insist on having our own city-specific quote-unquote standards to prevent that. But I'm not going to put a number on it, though.
I mean, it's a very interesting point, that. And can I ask a question back to you as an economist? Because the more you open up things, the more democratic, the more ownership of something there is, the less able, arguably, you are to make something work economically. The whole notion as to why you expressed about Alzheimer's is that somebody has to make some money out of selling a drug at the end of the day to bring a cure, and there are certain areas that require closure in order to extract some commercial value from it, and therein lies a tension. But if as we move towards more openness, is there less opportunity to explore any commercial potential?
Yeah, I mean, it depends entirely on the nature of the good or the service, and economics has got a pretty well-established set of theories for dealing with what you establish as a public good and where the market isn't an effective means, particularly if you can't declare any property ownership over it, exclude people from using it, and when you can't really capture the full value of something in the price you trade it for. So things like pollution, like Dave was talking about, the smell of the fab lab in the neighbouring houses, you can't capture that, and these externalities aren't reflected in the price, and that's when the traditional economic mechanism breaks down, and we do need to look at public responses, and if we try to solve pollution commercially, then it won't work. But on the other hand, things like, I think burgers is the typical example. You can stop someone eating a burger if you want to eat it, and it works very well as a commodity. And find myself supporting McDonald's suddenly by accident. But that is a case for capitalism.
But it also, in the context of that which is a public good is often paid for out of public service, and there's a dwindling amount of money. So technology, for example, that represents public good. There needs to be a certain platform of payment to get technology up to a certain level, and with the dwindling resources that are available, not only in the private sector but particularly in the public sector. Dave was talking to me before about the loss of 800 jobs in the city council again. How do we get those things? How do we now develop them? I mean, there are models, aren't there? There are interesting models in Manchester with Mad Labs. Dave mentioned Mad Labs before, where people are coming together and volunteering in many respects. But that can only go so far. Even those guys need some form of assistance from the public sector to make sure that they continue to exist. How can you begin to craft this into an economic situation where you can start to get some economic benefit back from your inventiveness in technology?
The beauty of Mad Lab is the willingness of people to contribute their time, and that's in fact I'm looking at the impact of Mad Lab right now, and that seems to be one of the greatest benefits, and that each of us that attend enjoy that. And I wonder whether we do need to be considering public funding for doing these things as traditional sort of nationalisation cases as the way government operates. So we've got the O'Reilly notion of the government as a platform, and John Sheridan was saying on Tuesday at the Business Models of Open Data workshop that perhaps the government doesn't need to be the producer and the seller and like the single sort of machine producing the data and this infrastructure, but maybe it should be more intervening in a legislative sense. That's to say, these are the protocols by which we're going to, let's adopt the 311 standard. Here are the criteria that you need to abide by to be a provider, and then open the market up to extend to do those things, but with the sort of the small government regulatory, bringing the consistency of smartness and allowing citizens and entrepreneurs to do the delivery.
Okay. Is there anybody else who would like to raise any questions at this point in time, or make any points, or cause any controversy?
I would just say, before we move on to the next speaker, that at least internationally, I mean, within countries, you can copy laws and regulations between jurisdictions much more easily, but copying them between countries is not easy at all. And so if we're thinking about this as an international endeavor, that may actually end up being the most problematic piece of it.
Okay. In which case, talking of international endeavor, Duncan Wilson from Intel.
Thank you. So, hello. So I'm Duncan from the Intel Cities Institute in London, working with UCL and Imperial College. And our purpose, if you like, is to explore how technology can enhance the social, economic and environmental well-being of cities. And we are a mix of scientists, engineers, anthropologists and architects. And we have three guiding principles that, if you like, describe the way that we're trying to think about cities. One is that we're designing with humans being a part of the system. So that's kind of the assumption that we make. The second is we're trying to build for the long term, and recognizing that the environments that we're trying to build into have a certain amount of, if you like, longevity, and therefore the imperfections of the real world. But also focusing very much on trying to deliver this triple bottom line benefit. So everything has to be thought of in terms of the socio-economic and environmental perspective. The Institute does have an open IP model, which is quite unusual from a corporate perspective. Everything that's done within it is open and public. And we have a team of about 20 people at the moment, which is primarily a mix of postdocs and PhDs and a few Intel researchers. This theme of the bespoke city is very interesting to me, and I want to try and answer the exam question that's been set at this point. But unfortunately, I want to answer it in two ways, which might be a bit of a cop-out. I kind of believe that actually the majority of the city has to be bespoke, and that's kind of, I guess, one of the assumptions that I make in terms of how I imagine the systems that we're having to put into place will be. So I'm imagining a large component of bespoke. However, underneath that, I'm actually imagining that there's probably a large, that's built from a large, if you like, building set or blocks of parts that are sort of made to measure. So I'm kind of assuming that there's an underlying infrastructure that probably is quite similar, that just gets assembled in different ways. So I hope that kind of answers that question to a degree. I've actually got three projects that I'm going to just very quickly talk through to try and explore some of the ideas around this idea of the bespoke city. One is around how we design with time in mind. The second is around how we can nurture this idea of letting go of things that we create so that others can then repurpose. And then finally, just a little comment on scale around how these things are that we're creating might need to be to go out into the wild. So first of all, So I was fortunate about 4 or 5 years ago to do some fantastic projects in schools where we were getting the school kids to help, if you like, design how the school building itself could become the science laboratory rather than having them doing science in classrooms. And in one of the workshops with the kids, we were trying to explore this notion of time, and the design time for the design life of the building came up in conversation, and the kids were quite surprised to learn that the actual building was expected to only last for 60 years. That was the design life of the particular school that we were building. Now, many buildings actually have much lower design times than that as well. But they then built this into trying to kind of understand how the rate at which the building might change varies to the things that were changing in it. And again, this idea of the teachers having trouble keeping up with the technology cycles that were taking place. And so we'd have kids saying that they were teaching their teachers how to teach IT. So you've got these kind of two very different paces of change. And this is kind of the 1.5 year cycle for technology and the 60-year cycle for the kind of the physical built environment. The other part to this is that we weren't creating the final designs. We were creating kind of playbooks for other architects or contractors to come and take hold of, to then go and implement in schools. So the project brief we had was just to kind of create a manual for things that could be done. So one of these ideas was this idea of a 60-year clock for the school that kind of showed the passage of time in a much longer cycle. And part of that was this idea of having an 8 for the 8 years in the school, an 8x60 matrix of pigeonholes. So a very physical receptacle that an object could be put in by each of the classes to reflect something from that year. So an object or a service or something that represented what an event that occurred that year. And then looking at how over the 3 generations of families that would go through this school, how that would change over time. Now, the interesting thing here is that there's the very physical manifestation of the actual hole in the wall, the pigeonhole, or in this case, they built a big wheel with boxes. But then there's other technologies like the QR codes and the RFID tags that they were using to tag the items in these pigeonholes that we kind of assumed would probably only last a year or two before easier ways to interact with these devices would stick. But also behind this, there was a database as well, which was again separate, and that might last for maybe 5 or 10 years. So I think there was this really interesting element between the different sort of timescales that we were having to work with. The second area is around serendipity, and I spent a lot of time in my previous job working around trying to monitor and understand workplace performance. So either things like space usage activity in office buildings, or in this case, or also things like energy and resource use. And what that typically meant was putting in wireless sensor networks to monitor the environments, or actually what we ended up doing was just repurposing the existing inbuilt infrastructure. So lots of buildings have building management systems that actually do have quite a few sensors in them, so we're trying to repurpose that. But there's an observation that I made in sort of working within that sector. About 8 years ago, I went to a conference for building management suppliers, if you like, and only one of them was talking about open standards. And that was the first time I actually heard them talking about, we have a system where you can get data out of it, and it is open, here's an API. About 5 years later, 5 years ago, so 3 years later, almost every vendor, their main selling pitch was, we have an open API to our system. You can get data out of it and exchange it. About 1 year ago, I was still struggling to get data out of building management systems. So there's a bit of a disconnect here between vendors saying, yes, our system can do this, and my experience of actually the reality of trying to get stuff out of buildings. And it's not just the text. It's also not just the, if you like, kind of the technical interface to these systems. There's challenges there, but it's also just trying to get, for example, access into this building management system. There's a whole load of stakeholders who own this building and who own the systems here. And what I found is that those systems are on different networks, they're owned by different people. Sometimes they're actually not necessarily anybody's individual responsibility in the company or in the building. So the interfaces to getting access to these things is also a political but quite difficult issue. The other observation on the display of this energy information as well is we were exploring the different places where it could be pushed out into. So we were kind of trying to push this back out into the community. From the energy perspective, this was to try and affect sort of behaviour change of the people in the building, try and make them more aware of how much resources were being used. Now, one of the things that I found in terms of trying to now, whilst the people that we're working with might have been early adopters of this technology, what we did find was that they all wanted to create their own bespoke interfaces. So the companies that were going in there with a kind of, yeah, this is the screen that you could use to display the information, they were getting some traction, but again, in my experiences, everybody wanted to tweak it slightly. And in some cases, this was by doing things like installations in lobbies and showing it in a very different format. But others, it was the marketing side of the company that were wanting to brand the messaging in a much stronger way. And the third area was around then the messaging that was conveyed. So I've had in a complete serious tone a building manager say to me, "Can we put an interface on this that only shows good news about how much energy we're using, as in so we don't report the bad news?" And that's when I was kind of, but surely that's the whole purpose of putting this in, is to actually show people that they're not doing as well as you want them to be doing. So I think we need to make this extra effort to actually understand how these things really do connect together, and it kind of comes back to sort of some of the open systems comments. And then finally, on scale, so Intel is obviously a company that makes its money from selling billions of devices. Yeah, so we make chips, and we need to sell lots and lots and lots of them. And I think that it's quite interesting to me what that then means to the kind of products that people like the Intels are trying to make, and how they try and get those out into the market. Now, the one nice thing about sort of landing in Intel and sort of peering behind the curtain a bit is I've started to observe the focus that they do have on trying to understand the products where these devices might appear, and also the attention to detail that they pay around trying to understand the experience people have around these products. And the whole motivation is to try and understand the future ecosystems that might be created, which they ultimately can try and provide and service for. So it's it is still very much kind of self-interested, but it's good that they are actually looking at that level of detail, in my opinion. Now, this later on this year, in the last quarter of this year, we're going to be deploying some new hardware from Intel into London, and that's raised some really interesting dilemmas for me in terms of what we're having to try and do, given that we're a research group and it's being driven by a product group in the firm, and they kind of have different motivations. Now, one component of this, so we're looking at 6 different scenarios that we're looking to be, or use cases, if you like, within the city, and there's going to be about 1,000 sensor endpoints around the city, just to give you kind of a scale of what we're looking at. And we're going to be exploring things like how much processing you do at the edge of the network versus up in the cloud, and looking at exploring technologies like data muling. So just these very simple ideas of this idea of every single sensor in a city beaming this data back up to the cloud. It's there's lots of research that shows that just isn't actually going to work. Yeah, so they aren't the technical realities of how this is actually going to happen. So things like data muling, where you will physically have packets of information being moved around by the inherent things that move around the city at the moment, us with our mobile phones, cars, vans, etc. And we were chatting to the product guys about this kind of war chest of the different challenges that we have. And to give you an example, we were typically focusing on very sort of local, community-driven projects. So, for example, trying to monitor an allotment, so that we could understand how the allotment community what kind of information or resources that they would help them as a community to grow vegetables. Whereas the Intel guys the product guys, were thinking, well, actually, we're slightly more interested in selling these sensors. We have a client over in China who wants to buy 3 million of them for the tomato factories that they have over there. So suddenly we've got allotments in North London versus tomato factories in China, and you get a sense of where some of the focus is in terms of where the product should be going to be developed. But of course, to me, so there is an economic reality there to some degree. But to me, the interesting point then is the monitoring in the greenhouses in China is probably going to be a fair bit simpler, because it's going to be quantitative measuring that's taking place. The measuring in the allotments in North London is probably going to be slightly different, because there's the whole qualitative factor around, John, who's been growing tomatoes for 40 years, doesn't need technology to tell him how to grow them better. So that technology is probably going to be doing something different in terms of developing the ecosystem. It still could be useful information, but it'll probably have a slightly different meaning, if you like. So there is this kind of interesting symbiotic relationship there between how these technologies can develop. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. We're going to go on in pretty quick fire succession now to Lane Doody. I suppose just the one thing that I was struck by in Duncan's presentation was the technology is propaganda and trying to filter out the bad news and promote the good, which inevitably is in the interests of large corporations in certain instances. But I'm also glad to hear from somebody from Intel say that they are unable to operate building management systems. I'm sure there are people out there from the co-op even who might also ask you the question about their own building management systems. Lane, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lane Doody and I work for Arup. I wasn't expecting to give my talk to the accompaniment of pictures of tomatoes, but I don't know how to get rid of it, so you'll just have to disregard that. It's not intended to. Oh, thank you. It's not intended to accompany my talk. Just a few words then on Arup, so that will to explain where I'm coming from in relation to this very difficult and interesting topic. Arup is we're a consultancy, we're a design and engineering consultancy, and we specialise in the built environment. And my role, I work in the IT consulting part of Arup, and my role is to lead the smart cities consulting. And I was delighted to have the opportunity to come and speak as part of this panel, because it's given me an opportunity to reflect on what is actually the role of the consultant in this whole smart cities, IT in cities topic. And I think our role is really to apply best practice and experience from one situation, city, to another. And our clients are, the kind of work we do is policy work, so we work for national government, we work for cities and local authorities, and we work for large urban developments, and we do that all around the world. And so the question of how do we apply what we know, how do we bring value to the clients that we're working for, how do we apply our experience, but in a way that actually makes sense for the problem that we're dealing with. So it's not just cutting and pasting from one report to another. And we were discussing this very question earlier on in the week. We had a master planning symposium in Arup, which brought together the sort of 40 or 50 people around Arup who work on master plans. So that includes the urban designers, the transport planners, the economists, and the other specialists, including us. And we were looking at this, discussing this very topic from a physical planning perspective. And the answer we came to really was that it is, because there was a discussion around architecture in particular. And there's one famous architect whose name I don't remember, but he has the view that he cannot work outside his native country. I think his native country is, I don't know whether it's Finland or but somewhere like that with quite specific climatic conditions. And his view is that no, you must know the terrain, you must know the region, you must know the people, you must know everything, and then you can only build to fit that, which is a very purist view. But actually, most architects work in multiple different places, and what they do is they apply underlying principles that from their experience and that they have learned to the situation that confronts them. And I think that's what we try to do. But I think in terms of the bespoke city, and I am going to try and answer Anthony's question, I think in terms of the bespoke city versus the cut and paste city, I think there are different scales and design times. So when we go to design, when we work on design, particularly of new places, there are different stages that you go through. So there's the architectural stage, which is concept design, and then there's schematic design, and then there's detailed design, and then you go into procurement and implementation. And I think at concept design, it's very much about taking ideas and concepts from other places and seeing if they fit the situations that you are dealing with. So the design process at Arup around new build, and I'll come to cities in a minute, around new build is that we have the spatial plan, we have the sustainable, and we put together a framework or a set of objectives for the different infrastructures that make up the city. And then we try and see how that we can achieve that using different interventions. And I think it's very possible at that point to apply things that you already know about and ideas and concepts that you already have to that place. I think the bespoke nature comes in the implementation. And as you go more and more into detailed design and implementation, you then need to think more about the users and the citizens who are actually going to access these things. In cities, you know, we've seen and I think Anthony spoke about it this morning, you know, the dispersion of the cycle schemes that has taken place in, I think you said 5 years. I mean, that's an idea and a concept that's been applied to lots of different places. But if you look at how it's been implemented in those places, there would be differences. And I think a lot of the differences are actually in the user interface, in the apps that people use to know where the different spaces are, in the maps that they're provided with. So I think a lot of it is around packaging and the interface, because that's what really touches people. The infrastructure, you know, can be, I think, I would argue, perhaps the same. And in terms of you know, in terms of our work, I think so. In new design projects, there are these stages which are quite clear. In existing cities, it's not so clear. And there are various, and I would say that one of the most important critical success factors is good clients. So, you know, I think good clients who work with you, so city leaders or you know, clients within cities who work with you and give you feedback and understand their own constraints and their own stakeholder environments and how they're working, they are the ones who will get the best out of their consultants. Clients who just say, well, you're the expert, you tell me, will get generic solutions. And I have worked with clients who say, well, you're the expert, you tell us. And they don't get, you know, you do your best, but they don't get the best out of their consultants because they're not, you know, it is a partnership. So I think in terms of the bespoke nature of the city, I would say that in terms of infrastructure, I think that a lot of the infrastructure can be the same, not in the implementation perhaps, but you know, I'm debating internally whether to put a percentage on it, but and caution is winning at the moment, but well, let's say maybe 80% of the infrastructure can be the same. But I think that the wrapper around that infrastructure in terms of the interface to the people and how people use that infrastructure, I think that is, let's say, less than 50% the same. Actually, maybe 20%. To throw a number out there. So I think that basically, you know, you have to look at different scales. We need city leaders and clients who will actually engage with this and grapple with it. I think that creates tension between top down and bottom up, which doesn't necessarily need to be there. At the moment, I think there's a lot of tension between what's happening on the ground, as Anthony said, and what is happening at the upper level. And I think that we need to find ways of engaging both the city activists and industry and academia and large corporations together to make these better, smarter cities. Thank you.
Thanks, Lane. I was thinking what you were saying then about cities and kind of the bespoke versus the engineered solutions. And Anthony, you touched on it before about how difficult it is to transfer these ideas between countries. But I was thinking about the technology behind the Oyster card and the way in which that makes our lives an awful lot easier when it comes to getting around London. And it's a perfect example of the application of amazing technology that captures data and processes it so quickly that it allows us through barriers within milliseconds, and we can get on a bus without having to worry about sorting our fee out. Now, you would have thought that that technology is really easy to transfer and apply to, for example, Manchester, where we still have a completely fractured system of trains, planes and automobiles. It's very difficult, in actual fact, to navigate your way around or to know how to sort yourself out around the ticketing, the myriad of ticketing opportunities that exist in this city. And it's a pity, really, isn't it? Because some of those underlying elements that you'd expect to be cut and paste and reused to make everybody's... There shouldn't really, in my mind, be any reason why we shouldn't be able to use the Oyster card throughout the country on all means of transport. But there are a whole reasons why that doesn't happen, and it's very complicated and it's very complex. Part of the reason for that is the fact that the transport systems here were deregulated, and there are a whole series of different ownerships now that are running bus routes in different areas, and they're not talking to the same people that are running the Metrolink network, and they're not talking to the same people who are running Overground Rail. It all boils down to perhaps unintended consequences and commercial interests that sparked all of this for different reasons, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And that's the frustration, really, that there are some very easy ways in which you can use bespoke technologies to make cities much more friendly, but in actual fact there are reasons why that can't happen, sadly, that are steeped in history. Our final speaker is Sascha Haselmayer, who's a fellow orange sock wearer, actually, as well, we noticed. If you care to monitor his socks whilst he's on stage.
Okay, so hi everyone. Yes, orange socks. We can have another session later around the colors of our socks. Now, everyone get your pens out. Now, we've had some fairly loose answers to Anthony's questions. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers around for the benefit that every one of you can kind of create your own outcome, and we can compare notes. And I do have an answer for you, and it will shock you. And I'm sure I've made some kind of mistake on the back of the paper there. So, my organization, what we do with CityMart is we run a global marketplace to matchmake 82 cities right now with about 6,500 technology providers. And someone actually called us the kind of Match.com between cities and technology companies. I thought that was a more elegant summary to the uninitiated. And so I'll talk about really how difficult it is to scale. And so today, scaling local innovations, if you invent an app, if you invent something in Manchester, why does it not spread like forest fire across many, many, many cities? And it's really hindered by three factors: by a lack of accountability in our decision-making, a lack of communications between those that have problems and those that generate solutions, and certainly a lack of transparency. And so here are some of the numbers just to give you a sense of how we try to picture what is going on. Cities represent really a very atomized marketplace, and that's quite unique. You have 557,000 local governments in the world, and they're not going to consolidate. There's not going to be some kind of IBM of local governments. You know, they're going to stay what they are, and that has all the kind of limitations. And especially the smaller providers have a major problem in selling to these governments. And the main problem they have is how the hell, out of 557,000 potential customers, with your new solution, are you going to find the one that wants to be the first to buy it, the second, the third? You know, you need to sell to thousands. You need to talk to thousands of governments, and really at any time in the day to kind of make sure that they have your information available when they need it. And this means companies spend almost 50% of their income on trying to find the next customer. To compare that to other industries in technology, they would spend about 10% of their income on selling. So the civic innovators, the companies or innovators that could really transform our cities, really cannot go to market in the way that works. On the other hand, we estimate that there are 380,000 providers of technology-enabled solutions and services for local government specifically. And it's simply not possible also for one of those 557,000 local governments to listen to 380,000 offerings. I mean, there's just a mismatch here in terms of the scales, in terms of the ability to listen and share. Now, to make matters even more complicated, 90% of local government tell us, and we run these surveys of local governments, they tell us that they do not trust the information that these kind of providers give them. So if you're a provider from Manchester and you want to sell something to Barcelona, where I live, 90% probability that the city will not trust any of the information you send me. Instead, what will happen is that the city will talk to a company they do know, and that happens to be a local company. They talk to a company they do know, and they will basically ask them to reinvent the solution from Manchester. Now, reinventing the wheel is extremely expensive. It costs, when you talk to technology or talk about technology-enabled services, it costs about 20 to 40 times the cost of buying the off-the-shelf product. And on top of that, it delays getting the solution to the citizen by 4 to 8 years. So, and when we're reinventing the wheel, another thing happens. Technology has a wonderful rationalizing capability. You know, it's creative destruction at its purest sometimes, because it creates shortcuts. It cuts out the middleman. It makes new processes entirely possible. By reinventing the wheels, cities generally are incorporating all the old inefficient vested interests into the technologies just to make everyone happy. And the Oyster card is a great example. I mean, Octopus in Hong Kong was created for a number of reasons, to do more with money laundering than anything else, but it was the first smart card for transport. And the reason why it doesn't scale is that local transport tends to be organized in almost mafia-like structures. But another example is Telefonica, a well-known company that designed a parking system for cities, a mobile phone-based parking system 7 years ago. And each transaction generated 2 payments to Telefonica and 4 payments to the regional savings banks. Okay, that was the localized reinvention interpretation of what mobile parking could be, a product that you could buy off the shelf from Tallinn in Estonia at the time for 30,000 euros. So we found that in all this process, there's a very small window of opportunity where actually decision-making in cities can be affected. And this is what we call the moment when the city knows they have a problem they can solve, but they haven't yet decided on how to solve it. That really creates the big moment of possibility in which the market can inspire the city, the citizens, and where a lot of possibilities can happen. And the way we work around this is that we actually get cities to publish these problems very, very early on. And these are very, very sometimes simple problems, sometimes complex problems. And what we found that it creates an enormous momentum in the marketplace, not just to have solutions, but also to be willing to invest in the city, which is something, as we heard earlier, cities like Manchester desperately need. They need support, they need participation and partnership. So we exclude in this process the obligation of cities to pay for the technologies. We actually invite the providers in to put them on the ground, to demonstrate them live. And after running this for 3 years, we've had some interesting results. So 380 technology providers have actually so far formally committed to, at no cost, invest in cities to participate in solving their problems. This is not grassroots technology. These are real companies with a business plan that go to the city and effectively set up a demonstrator in real life. And this has solved 76 challenges in 39 cities. And on top of it, through this process, the cities have discovered 10,000 new solutions to their problem that they didn't know before. And these are solutions that range from the now operating open data cloud in San Francisco to the video distribution model that is now being implemented in Lagos for the entire African diaspora, because Lagos is the home of Nollywood, the world's 3rd largest movie industry and movie cluster. And what is very interesting, that all of these solutions that were selected by cities as being the most high potentials, all of these were solutions by small and medium-sized companies. But what is also interesting is that we find that the scaling of these solutions happens when these smaller providers partner with corporations like Intel, Oracle, Philips, and others, because those actually have the power to really provide the industrial scale and distribution. So I was in the briefing, I was asked not about the percentage, that's a new question that emerged today, but about cities forming partnerships to implement solutions. And I'm really skeptical of this whole thing that cities can create standards to kind of make all of that really easy. And partly this is from experience. For years and years and years, we've had projects in the US and Europe and elsewhere trying to kind of have joint purchasing of solutions, joint standard development. They've really gone nowhere. They really haven't delivered anything, with the exception of open data, which is not really procuring anything but making a resource available. And there just doesn't seem to be any really compelling argument for that to happen. On the other hand, what we have seen work is when cities make so-called forward commitments, when they say that if you gave us an electric motorbike that could park itself, we would buy 1,000 pieces of those. And those things seem to be much more promising in stimulating the market. What cities are good at are kind of jointly tackling major challenges. And one of the programs that we've just launched and that we're very proud of is a program where we've partnered with Dublin City Council and the United Nations on a program where cities jointly invest and commit themselves to deploying technology to eliminate poverty. And they have a very clear measure and very clear public commitment on how they want to solve poverty challenges, but they're not actually committing to which technology will solve that problem, which I think creates a lot of openings. Now, Anthony, here's your figure. And I must have gotten something terribly wrong, but so here are my assumptions for your percentage. So from our knowledge of how services in cities are categorized, there are about 20 target groups, 20 channels you try to reach, so students, elderly people, children, and so forth. There, in average, I would say that's a gut feeling in a city, about 100 service areas that are technology enabled, things like transport information, things like health information, quantified self, and so forth. And we usually see about 4 different business models for each of these services that are often deployed in parallel. Those are cheaper, having cheaper services, shared services, creating new opportunities, better services. So you could kind of say that you kind of have 800 services running in a city that are technology enabled. And we can change that assumption around maybe if I'm completely wrong. Now, if you wanted to have every local government in the world to be 100% bespoke, that's 8,000. 20 times 100 is 8,000. My God, though. Then okay, that's even more hopeless then. So 8,000. Well done. Thank you. This is. I was hoping I got this the other way wrong, but. So let's say that 557,000 local governments wanted to be 100% bespoke. That would mean each of them would have to have 8,000 bespoke services operating. If we multiply that, that would be roughly 4.5 billion solutions. Is that right? 557,000 times 8,000, in my mind, makes 4.5 billion solutions that we would need to have deployed in our communities. Anthony said earlier we have 750,000 apps in the App Store. So what percentage of the world is bespoke? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm actually now going to invite the speakers to step on stage whilst we try to tease out some participation and discussion with the audience. If you could sit in the order in which you spoke, that might just help order, if that's not too complicated an ask. I know we're in that kind of post-lunch, mid-afternoon haze, but I'm pretty sure you'll be able to work it out. Anthony, you've got your mic there, and you work that side of the room, I'll work this side. I mean, you've heard a lot in this afternoon's debate and discussion. Anthony did say he wanted some provocation, so I hope that some of you are prepared to prod and poke. We've heard talk about the role of education and liberal governance. We've heard talk about the relationship of technology and humanity on the impact and the growth of our cities. We heard of scale and technology cycles and serendipity, the difference in time around our own life cycles and that of technology and the implications that that has. And also the role of the professional in terms of delivering technology in our cities. And finally from Sascha, highlighting the frustrations of the transferability of technology between cities for all various reasons and various impediments, suggesting that only a small percentage of what we do can actually be replicated. Before we open the discussion, I suppose one thought from me, there's a lot of talk, I mean, it's interesting, this issue about bespoke cities and the idea of cut and paste. I think that cut and paste was the worst single technological innovation that ever occurred, because cut and paste has resulted in it's used without thought, without intelligence. I think we use cut and paste too frequently, and believe that it's actually speeding things up, and in actual fact it's slowing things down, because people will, in my experience, take bits of documents that they've seen from colleagues in different cities and ask that to be sent to them, and they'll kind of cut and paste that into their document, and they'll bring it in from Birmingham, from Glasgow, from Edinburgh, and then they'll kind of amalgamate this into documents that then get issued for tender. So they'll be asking people either development of a bespoke technology or even the development of real estate, and we're ending up with a whole series of frustrations, impediments that needn't be in our way. Nobody's thinking intelligently. Cut and paste is just used without thought, without editorship. And in actual fact, I think in order to progress, we probably need to whittle that down, and we do need to think about solutions that are considered and delivered more efficiently and more effectively. You've got the panel in front of you, and you must have some questions that you wish to ask. Am I going to be faced with a sea of... Right. The gentleman here in the grey shirt, please, in the middle, followed by... There's a mic on its way to you here. If you could say your name and your organisation, please.
Hello, my name's Paul. I work for a few people, but one of my businesses that I work with is I'm a partner with Actuate, and we're a future city company. But I'm really passionate about cities and where I live and what I do. I didn't get that this afternoon. I think what I'd like to hear, and maybe get some feedback about, what are the great things that you have seen in your work that you've done? What are the great challenges that you want to address? What are some of the really spectacularly fantastic people that you've worked with? We got a real quite low-key presentation for everybody, but, you know, cities are really difficult, you know, people are difficult, so it's a bit of a challenge back to you, and I want you to just replay, maybe have a think about some of the real positive, interesting things that you've experienced that you could share with us.
Guys, you're being accused of not entertaining or provoking the audience. Now is your chance to redeem yourself, right. Dave Carter.
That's fascinating. That's the first time ever I've been criticised for being downbeat. I'm usually on the end of a hell of a lot of stick for talking things up, saying we can do, and all the rest of it. And I mean, the thing for me, and it is kind of partly is an attempt to answer your point, Nick. Another way of looking at cut and paste is great ideas, bring them back home, see how you have to repurpose, reassemble them and sell them. And that's how Manchester made all its money. I mean, the textile industry, the engineering industry, we bought a lot of good ideas and good skills, and we combined them with the kind of natural talents of the ordinary people who were here, and then we reassembled stuff and we sold it all over the world. The same is absolutely true about music. You know, the person who inspired me most is the late, great Tony Wilson. And Tony always said what was fantastic about meeting creative people is, you know, you wouldn't patent it, but when you brought it back home and said, this is something completely new, it's from Manchester, and in fact it had already been playing in the clubs of Detroit for 5 years, it didn't matter. Because if people felt that, they'd generate a passion, they'd have an aspiration to do something with that kind of, in that case, creativity, as they did 100, 150 years before with products. So, you know, I think there are some fantastic things about cities that generate that. And the cut and paste element, if you're inspired, we were inspired by Digitale Stad, Digital City Project Amsterdam, 1993. We came back, we ripped off, with their permission, as much as we could. We repurposed it and we called it Digital City Manchester. And it went, fantastic, what a brand new idea. We said, yeah, I hope you don't go to Amsterdam too often. But anyway, we got on with it.
Sorry, we'll just take a few more. We'll take two more of the panellists to give us a response to that question, because it's quite a provocation.
Yeah, so thank you for asking this, because, I mean, what I'm really passionate about is these thousands of solutions that we're working with. And I give you two very quick examples. Boris is a blind man who lives in Stockholm, who says he now is 90% less disabled than he was before because he can navigate the city freely. He can walk around with a small navigation device that he carries. It's like a Wii controller welded together with a TomTom. And you know, he feels so liberated. It's for a blind person, really the first time in history that a blind person can leave the house without asking anyone for permission. But also from the city side, they see it now as the enabler that Boris can go out and find himself a job, that Boris no longer needs physical rehabilitation because they drive him around everywhere, so he needs to have these different classes. It's, for me, this is the most transformative solution I've seen anywhere, and the most enabling solution. It affects 162 million people around the world, and it involves no difficult, no complex technology. Maybe later on I might come back to some other examples, but I mean, you know, and Boris is a real person, and he's spectacular.
That's great. I do hope that Boris's engine isn't being driven by the iPhone mapping app, because that would cause all kinds of problems.
Let me just add to this. So another city was really interested in it. It runs on Symbian because it has for blind people the best interface in terms of translating into voice. City of Barcelona right now is running an innovation project, an R&D project, to reinvent the same service on the basis that it wasn't operating on Android or iPhones, which blind people don't use. But the city thinks it's not an app if it's not developed for that. So they're reinventing the whole thing just because they didn't like the idea that it would run on Symbian, which is another indication of how blind-focused, let's say, that decision-making process was.
Absolutely. Catherine, and then we'll go back to the floor.
Yeah, so sorry if I haven't communicated my enthusiasm. I think if you have a look at the Urban Prototyping website, there's actually some really fantastic examples of citizen-led change and prototype change. So, for example, air quality measurement that is citizen-led, so that people know when, you know, can indicate asthma problems and where pollution is really occurring. Well, you know, at Imperial we work with students every day, so I'm bombarded by enthusiasm, so perhaps I'm a little bit subdued because of that. But there's some really great projects going on with the students. So, for example, some of them are looking at how you would create musical instruments using basically a small microphone and using a mobile app, and that turns basically any surface into a musical instrument. It's whimsical, but it's kind of cool and very playful. You know, and then there's some great computer science guys who are building massive data analytics platforms, but are always enormously so enthusiastic. So you can check those out on the websites.
Thank you. Just before I come to you, the gentleman with the green sweater. No, you want to move on. So, gentleman down here in the black, followed by the lady immediately in front of him.
Hello, I'm Sebastian Weiss from Lancaster University. I found this very interesting. I think my observation from having you guys here is really much that this is a problem, this the smart city is really a problem for us all to debate and to actually negotiate what it means and how we can maybe tackle some of these challenges of technology adoption with regards to the scaling and with regards to the standards that we all talk about. I think with regards to this question of how much can be bespoke and how much can be cut and paste, I just wanted to add this example that I found in Aarhus when I went there. And there I met somebody called Martin Brunsko. And I thought it was really great to talk to him. He said to me, I elaborated for 4 years to actually get the city council work with me on a smart city project. And after 4 years and probably many more challenges, they actually got together then the president from the local university, the head of the city council, and some important businesses there in the area, which really was this platform for enabling rethinking of all city services in 36 different work groups. And for me, this was really interesting to see because the citizens were really involved themselves. And I think the most important critical part seems to me that there's a certain enablement of the citizens to actually set up the technologies and to actually reinvent what the institutions actually mean for them. And then maybe you can, in these processes, think about repurposing the technologies that are out there. So maybe the question would be, what do you think about institutions and the importance of institutions in tackling some of these challenges and the way they can maybe bar progress just by politicking between different interest groups?
Thank you. The lady immediately in front of you had a question. Anthony, can we get the mic down here? And I'm conscious of time. Can we take a few points and then come back to the panel?
Thank you. My name is Sam. I'm an enthusiastic engineering student. Sorry. I think my question relates to sort of more the literal development of smart cities. So I kind of wanted to ask, what about smart city envy in the sense that obviously other cities will see other cities developing, and I think one of the key results of a smart city is to a certain extent economic prosperity. And if other cities are aware of this, that sorry, I'm struggling to articulate myself here. In terms of sort of relating to the whole cut and paste and bespoke rule, wouldn't there be a desire to maybe perhaps over bespoke so that certain cities stand out compared to other cities in their culture and their behaviour as well as their sort of economic prosperity and social development? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take another one from Rory and then we'll come to the panel. Rory, you had a question.
Yeah, it was just a comment really about the discussion that we had earlier about how do you monetize these things and where, how do we make these things economically viable. So the parent company of Noma is the cooperative group, so another Manchester story really, but back in the early industrial revolution, and people in the aspiring middle class, and I think we romantically think of it as working class people, but it was really middle class people, who decided that the existing economic models weren't working for them and were providing a disservice to the community that they were involved in. So they got together and decided to create a new economic model to serve their own interests and work collaboratively to deliver that. And I think that the thing that fascinates me about the whole discussion in the last 2 days is that we're now wrestling with this idea of how society can collaborate in ways which are different from the established systems that we have, and it seems to just reflect really back to that industrial revolution challenge that we had 165 years ago when the co-op started. There was a confusing but interesting discussion about bitcoins on the Today program this morning. So, maybe we're going to see a new digital currency and that will sort it all out for us. But I think that the fact that we don't have an answer is the attraction of the problem, because humanity tends to find an answer when the critical problem arises. So co-ops will be the answer.
Can I throw out one quick comment myself before we turn to them? I want to ask you guys to challenge you guys. What should Manchester do? What should it build for itself? What should it share? What should it copy? If it wants to create solutions for itself, if it wants to be a national or an international leader in importing and sharing solutions. And also, in the words of Lane, to make itself a good client to the industry partners that are going to be providing technology for it.
Well, I'm not quite sure how many native Mancunians, and inevitably Dave will want to answer that question first. Dave, if you can go briefly, and then I'll pass on to the others.
Just touch on a couple of other things. I mean, the co-op movement, for example, is something that's rediscovering digital. I mean, .coop is still the only domain name that is not open, so you can't exploit it. You actually have to be a co-op. There's governance. You're checked. So it's a trusted brand increasingly in the digital world. Most of the biggest internet exchanges, London Internet Exchange, Links, AM6, Amsterdam, are mutuals. They're mutually, and they're co-ops. So the model, I think, is very relevant, particularly when you think of Creative Commons and the kind of open source software movement and so on. But just on the Manchester side, I think from our point of view, and I've been really engaged in this as a community activist before joining the council, and then as a kind of civil servant, where sometimes I actually have to keep my mouth shut, even though I'm kind of still a community activist as well outside of work, is that what we have to do is inspire people. You can't be a smart city when we know we have 17.5% of our adult population who are offline completely, probably the same amount as Gen, so that means a third, if you total it up, who don't really have proper access to the internet, and the kind of Go On campaign we've launched as part of the digital strategy. So digital inclusion is just as important today as it was 20 years ago when we started the first digital inclusion campaign. So because you can't have a smart city unless you've got smart people, and smart people means everyone, or certainly as many as possible, and you do need to engage people. So I really think, Anthony, you picked up something I hadn't thought about myself, but yes, skills, the idea of skills and learning and what sustains that, and how you get people to be aspirational to go on and learn things is something we can share. And I just say that from basic experiences. So much of what we've done in this city is a combination of stuff that was here already, that was born out of the conflicts in some ways between idealism and desperation, because I can tell you in the 80s we were desperate to see how we saved the city, sort of thing. And these amazing things because we network. So the most important the city's got to do is commit itself to networking and going round and openness, and then some of the other keywords like co-production I'll come back to perhaps. But if the city says that's what we're going to do and really means it, people will have faith in it. And if it just says it and doesn't mean it, this point about the envy thing, then people aren't stupid. And that's the problem. A lot of technology assumes that people are stupid, and they see through that. So it's about recognising the talent and the skills and giving people an opportunity to do something with it.
I'll take one more comment from Duncan, if that's all right. And then we're going to go to the 5-minute kind of wrap-up, where Anthony's going to pull out a few of the points that have been made, and then Drew asked us all, or asked you guys, for pithy statements to camera, in order that that it can be kind of cut and edited for later consumption. So you're going to have to think, whilst that's all going on, about some pithy statements that you wish to make. The one thing that I would say is that the issue about the cooperative movement in this city, and the issues that you guys were touching on about governance. The other aspect to all of this is enterprise, and I think that enterprise is a critical component in terms of liberating technology in cities. But what the cooperative movement represented really was enterprise with a conscience. It was the ability to encourage people to produce and to make sure that the benefit of that coming together was shared by as many people as possible. And I think that that's an interesting model that's still applicable 160, 170 years on. Duncan.
Okay, so I'm going to try and answer the first question, Anthony's question and Sebastian's question all in one if I can. I'm really excited about the potential that I've seen within the 22,000 schools. Admittedly, I've only seen about 10 of them in reality, in terms of the way that as kind of centres of communities that are looking at how they can engage in intelligent ways with the just the way of living that they're having, and in very practical terms, this means kids using IT for learning how to do stuff. And they're using it in really novel ways, in ways that I was just kind of completely blown away when I went and saw how they were doing it. The issue is, though, is it's not being done everywhere, and it's a very, very imbalanced system. And so one of the challenges that we have is to how can you get some of that kind of teaching materials into the schools where, for example, even just things as simple as sharing data when kids are doing experiments. In a typical class, they can spend the whole lesson just getting data out of a data logger, whereas they should be starting the lesson with the data that comes out the data logger. Just very simple, little trivial things like that. Then also, how do you then create to Sebastian's point, how do you create the ecosystem where the teachers actually have motivation to use that data in a shared way, so that these 22,000 schools aren't individual, islands, because they aren't very connected at the moment. And to me, that's a fantastic challenge that we have, where the kids who are being exposed to that are the ones that are coming out into the marketplace, seeing that as being the normal. And I guess it's seeing some of the kids who thought it was normal was so rewarding. It's just a shame that not all kids are seeing that.
Thank you. Anthony, you threw the gauntlet down.
Yeah, we haven't done the calculation that Sascha challenged, but I don't want to do it because it scares me. So let's just leave the question unanswered and say that we disagree. I just want to sum up real quick a couple of issues that I think came up that, again, probably unanswered, but these are the things we're going to need to work on going forward. Both Sascha and Lane, towards the end, talked about trust. And it hadn't occurred to me just what a huge issue this is. Who do we trust to provide us solutions, to provide us advice, to tell us what's important that we should look at elsewhere and we should think about bringing into our own community? That is something that's, I think, just going to require a lot of time to unpack. And then the other big question is, where is value created? Is it in that 80% of the infrastructure that's going to be the same that we can copy and paste between cities? Or is it going to be that 80% of the interface that has to be bespoke for particular communities or language groups or people with disabilities, et cetera? And then I just wanted to sort of, on an optimistic note, highlight a couple things that I hadn't thought about that probably can be copied much more extensively than they are now. Best practices, planning methods, procurement practices, contractors can be shared between cities. And even you can start thinking about, as Duncan was talking about, entire ecologies of users and devices and infrastructure. We might be able to think about copying those between cities. So I think the answer is sort of more of both, more cutting and pasting and more bespoke, but very different combinations in different places. So I'll turn it back to you.
Well, we need to run through your pithy statements. I suppose the one thing that struck me is this title about smart cities and whether, in actual fact, that's an oxymoron. Can cities actually be smart? I mean, we've heard an awful lot about frustrations. There's an awful lot to be learnt. There's an awful lot that can be translated. But for one reason or another, it seems that there are impediments to the translation of that to actually make our lives easier and perhaps more interesting. And I'm sure that, Sascha, you more than anyone, as a dating enterprise between technology and cities, will have a greater insight into the issues and whether a city can actually be smart, or whether it's the people in the city that make them smart. Can we run left to right? Dave, putting you on the spot, a couple of summary points.
Pithy statements. Two things then. Just another bit of history. The great historian de Tocqueville said that real change happens when people's expectations exceed their material conditions, and we've seen that again and again, in whether it's Arab Spring, whether it's in other grassroots action around the country, and that's what we've got to do. So the three things that come from that are to make that happen, you have to give people aspirations. That's absolutely clear. To back those aspirations up, you have to have some real leadership, a word that, people are often uncomfortable with. But it's not just from one place. It's good civic leadership, it's good business leadership, it's good grassroots leadership. And then you have to have some practical plans, because unless you do, all the rest is just talk about smart cities. But if you combine those things and you link them up so that your practical plans based on your leadership feed back into aspirations, then people's expectations will rise and they'll demand change, and change at the end of the day will never come from technology, it comes from people.
Okay, thanks. So I'll come back to my original thought, which is basically that cities are nothing without the people in them, and technology that ignores the humanity that it's supposed to be interacting with will ultimately fail to be successful. So for me, I think that very much learning how to generate trust in the privacy, the security, and also the actual interaction between the human and the decision-making system and how that actually works is going to be a fundamental part of any smart city.
Perfect. Duncan.
And I guess for me, looking into this, it's really made me focus on the fact that I guess it's probably that the socio-economic value is created, I think, through the more bespoke systems. And kind of what I've added in from the conversation today is also maybe when there's an element of subversion in there as well, which I think is kind of quite a nice additional element.
Lane.
So I think that cities need to learn from other cities, and they need to take ideas from other places, but they need to customize it for their own context. And they need to create ways to mainstream pilots, so that cities need to create ways that they can institutionalize innovation. And they need the governance structures that allow them to do that, that allow that top-down sort of space for then the bottom-up to innovate and then spread that innovation throughout the entire council.
Great. And Sascha, finally.
So I would say that it's really a matter, or the really interesting question is accountability, and that connects to transparency, that connects to participation, and particular in how each city will prioritize which problems it's going to solve through technology or other means. And I think there are many ways in which we've seen many cases where cities solved problems they thought would be solved by robots through smarter people. Mm-hmm. And smarter ways of separating waste instead of creating waste systems. So I think that's a massive opportunity, is to actually look at how can we make all the decision-making processes in the city more accountable and have a story that is always about what is the problem we want to solve. And I will connect to what Dave said here is what is the project, the new project we want to do, not just solving problems, but actually meeting our aspirations in that process.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, would you thank the panel? Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.